The hotel was old, tucked away in a forgotten corner of a small town, with faded carpets, dim lighting, and a stillness that pressed in like a weight. When John arrived late in the evening, he was tired from his drive and looking forward to nothing more than a shower and a good night's sleep. The girl at the front desk greeted him with a polite but subdued smile, sliding the key to room 302 across the counter. "Enjoy your stay," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But one thing, there's a door down the hallway on the third floor, just before your room. It doesn't have a number. It's locked and no one is allowed inside. Please don't try to open it. And whatever you do, don't look through the keyhole." John blinked, caught off guard by her serious tone. For a moment, he thought she might be joking, but her face was impassive.
"Why?"
"What's in there?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. She didn't answer, just gave a slight shake of her head. "Enjoy your stay," she repeated, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. John shrugged, taking the key. It wasn't the first strange warning he'd encountered at an off-the-beaten-path hotel, and it likely wouldn't be the last. He chalked it up to local superstition, or maybe an attempt to add some quirky mystique to the place. He climbed the creaky staircase to the third floor and walked down the dimly lit hallway. Sure enough, just before his room, there it was, a plain wooden door, unmarked and unassuming. It seemed perfectly ordinary, but now, armed with the receptionist's cryptic warning, it felt charged with an almost magnetic pull. John hesitated in front of it, feeling the first prickle of curiosity. He reached out as if to test the handle, but he stopped himself. Not tonight. He'd been traveling all day and was too tired to entertain ghost stories or hotel mysteries. He shook his head, opened the door to room 302, and stepped inside. But as he lay in bed later that night, staring at the cracked ceiling, the girl's warning replayed in his mind. What was behind that door? Why did it have no number? And why, specifically, was he not supposed to look through the keyhole? The next evening, after spending the day exploring the small town, John returned to the hotel. The unanswered questions from the previous night still lingered, tugging at his curiosity. He told himself it was nothing, a silly warning meant to play on a guest's imagination, but the more he tried to ignore it, the stronger the urge became. After a quick dinner, John found himself pacing the hallway. The unnumbered door loomed at the end, bathed in the dim glow of a flickering wall sconce. He looked around. The hallway was empty. Heart pounding, he approached the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached it, he hesitated for a moment, then placed his hand on the cold metal handle. It didn't budge. Locked, as expected. But then his gaze drifted to the keyhole. Just one peek, he thought. What's the harm in that? Slowly, he bent down and pressed his eye to the small, dark opening. At first, all he could see was darkness. But as his eyes adjusted, he realized he was looking into a room identical to his own. Same layout, same furniture. The only difference was the eerie stillness inside. In the corner of the room, sitting on the floor with her back to the wall, was a woman. Her skin was pale, unnaturally so, as if it had been drained of all color. Her long white hair spilled over her shoulders, and she wore a tattered white dress. She was perfectly still, her face turned away from the door. John's breath caught in his throat. He stared for a moment longer, the cold air from the keyhole brushing against his eye. The woman didn't move, didn't make a sound. Something about her stillness made his skin crawl. Suddenly, a chill ran down his spine, and he pulled back. He glanced around the hallway, half expecting someone to be watching him, but it was still empty. With a shiver, he hurried back to his room and locked the door behind him. The next morning, John couldn't shake the image of the pale woman.
Who was she?
Why was she in that room? He thought about asking the receptionist, but decided against it. She had already warned him not to look, admitting that he would likely only earn him a scolding. But by that evening, his curiosity got the better of him again. He found himself standing in front of the door, the faint hum of the hallway lights buzzing in his ears. His hands trembled as he bent down to look through the keyhole once more. This time, all he saw was red. A solid, unbroken sheet of red, as if something had been placed directly against the other side of the keyhole. He frowned, confused. Had someone noticed him peeking and blocked the keyhole? Or was this some strange trick of the light? He straightened up and glanced around nervously, the uneasy feeling in his stomach growing stronger. That night, the dreams began. He dreamed of the pale woman, her featureless face turning slowly toward him. Her eyes, empty, blood-red voids, bored into his soul as she whispered his name. He woke up in a cold sweat, the sound of her voice echoing in his ears. The next morning, John couldn't take it anymore. He marched down to the reception desk, his nerves frayed and his mind racing. The girl from the first night was there, her calm demeanor unchanged. "What's behind that door?" he demanded. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Did you look through the keyholes?" He hesitated, then nodded. She sighed, setting down the papers she'd been sorting. "I warned you not to," she said softly. "Now you've seen her." "Who is she?" John asked, his voice trembling. "What is she?" The girl glanced around, as if checking to make sure no one else was listening. "Years ago, a man and his wife stayed in that room. They were different. Albinos. Their skin, their hair, their eyes, everything about them was pale. But their relationship was unhealthy. One night, the husband snapped and killed her in a fit of rage. Ever since, her spirit has been trapped in that room." John's blood ran cold. "What does that have to do with me?" The receptionist's expression darkened.
Her eyes, she said.
They were blood red. "If all you saw was red, it means she saw you too." John didn't sleep that night. Every shadow in his room seemed to shift and move, and every sound felt amplified. He kept the lights on, but it didn't help. The feeling of being watched was suffocating. Around 3 a.m., the whispers started. Faint at first, like a breeze slipping through a crack in the window. Then louder, forming words. "Why did you look?" John froze, his breath hitching in his throat. The voice was coming from the hallway. Slowly, against every instinct screaming at him to stay put, he got out of bed and opened the door. The hallway was empty, but at the far end, the unnumbered door was ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling out from within. A figure stepped into the hallway. The pale woman. Her blood-red eyes locked onto his, and she smiled, a cold, twisted smile that froze him in place. The lights flickered and went out. The hallway was swallowed by darkness, leaving John standing in a silence, so deep it felt alive. The pale woman's red eyes glowed faintly at the far end, her twisted smile frozen in place. He couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even blink. His body felt like it wasn't his own anymore. The unnumbered door swung open wider, and the shadows around it seemed to stretch out like long, skeletal fingers, beckoning him forward. John's legs moved on their own, each step slow and deliberate. He wanted to run, to scream, but something inside him, a deep, primal fear, kept him silent. As he neared the door, the air grew colder, and he swore he could hear faint whispers. They weren't coming from the woman. They were coming from the room itself, a chorus of voices layered over one another, hissing and murmuring in a language he didn't understand. He stopped in the doorway, trembling. The room was just as he'd seen through the keyhole, identical to his own, but somehow wrong. The air felt thick and oppressive. The corners of the room seemed to stretch endlessly into shadows, and in the center of the room, the pale woman stood perfectly still. Her head tilted slightly, and she whispered, "You shouldn't have looked." Before he could respond, the door slammed shut behind him, trapping him in the suffocating darkness. John fumbled for the door, his hands shaking as they slid across the cold wood. No handle, no hinges, just smooth, unbroken surface. Panic gripped him as he turned back to the room, where the pale woman was now closer, standing just a few feet away. Her face, though featureless, seemed to shift. Where her red eyes should have been, there were now empty sockets, black and infinite. Her mouth twisted into something impossible, stretching far beyond what a human face should allow. "You've seen too much," she hissed. Her voice echoed in his head, louder than it should have been. The walls of the room began to bleed, thick, dark liquid seeping from the cracks and pooling on the floor. The light above flickered, And suddenly, the walls weren't walls anymore. They were faces. Pale, eyeless faces pressing through the surface, their mouths open in silent screams. John staggered back, his foot slipping in the growing puddle of blood. He hit the ground hard, the crimson liquid soaking into his clothes. The pale woman loomed over him, her twisted form bending and stretching as though her bones had melted. He clawed at the floor, desperate to find some escape, but his hands found something unexpected, a key. Cold and jagged, it felt like it had been placed there for him to find. Without thinking, he gripped it tightly and looked up at the pale woman. Her expression shifted again, and for the first time, she seemed afraid. The whispers in the room grew louder, rising into a chaotic crescendo as John scrambled to his feet. The key in his hand felt impossibly heavy, its surface etched with symbols he couldn't understand. The pale woman's twisted form began to retreat, her movements jerky and unnatural. "That doesn't belong to you," she hissed, her voice layered with an otherworldly growl. "Give it back." John didn't know why, but he clutched the key tighter. The instant he did, the room shifted. The bleeding walls receded, and the eyeless faces disappeared. The oppressive darkness lifted slightly, replaced by a dim, flickering light that seemed to come from nowhere. He looked around, and for the first time, he noticed something strange. The walls were covered in carvings. They depicted scenes of people entering the room, each one looking through the keyhole before being swallowed by shadows. In the final carving, a figure held a key, just like the one in his hand, and the shadows seemed to shrink away from them. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This key wasn't just a random object, it was the only way out. The pale woman's form stretched unnaturally, her fingers elongating into claws as she lunged toward him. "You don't understand what you've taken," she screamed, her voice reverberating off the walls. John turned and ran, gripping the key so tightly it dug into his palm. The door was still gone, replaced by an unbroken stretch of wall. John's chest tightened as he realized he was trapped. But then, the key began to glow faintly in his hand, pulsing like a heartbeat. Desperation drove him to act. He dropped to his knees in front of where the keyhole should have been and pressed the key against the wall. At first, nothing happened. But then, the wall began to ripple like water, and the faint outline of a keyhole appeared. Behind him, the pale woman let out a shriek so loud it made his ears ring. He didn't look back. He couldn't. With shaking hands, he inserted the key into the glowing keyhole and turned it. The moment the lock clicked, the room exploded into chaos. The walls shattered like glass, revealing a swirling void of red light and shadows. The whispers turned into screams, and the air itself seemed to twist and writhe. John crawled through the opening, pulling himself into the void just as the pale woman's claws slashed at his back. The moment he was through, the keyhole disappeared, sealing the room behind him. John woke up in the lobby, sprawled on the cold marble floor. The receptionist was standing over him, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "You shouldn't have looked," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You shouldn't have taken the key." John sat up slowly, his body aching. The key was still in his hand, its glow now faint and flickering. "What is this place?" he demanded. "What was in that room?" The receptionist hesitated, her gaze darting to the shadows that seemed to linger in the corners of the lobby. "This hotel, it's not like others. It doesn't belong entirely to this world. That room, it's a bridge. A doorway to something older, darker. The people who built this place tried to seal it off, but they couldn't destroy it. The key, it's the only thing that keeps it contained." John stared at the key, his stomach sinking. "So, what happens now?" She looked at him with a mix of pity and fear. "You've taken the key. The room will come for you. It always does." Before he could respond, the lobby lights flickered, and the shadows on the walls began to stretch toward him. The receptionist backed away, her face pale. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "There's nothing I can do." As the shadows closed in, John gripped the key tightly, his mind racing. He had escaped once. He could do it again. But deep down, he knew the truth. The hotel had claimed him. And no matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, the room would always be waiting.